Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT How to Play video. Today our analyst will be diving into how to play Hellion Invoker for patch 11.11. We're going to reroll meta after the shop changes of patch 11.11, but don't fret, there's other compositions you can play that don't require rerolling. One such composition is Hellion Invoker, which relies on the strength of early Hellions to transition into Teemo late game. We'll be covering core items, champions, and traits, as well as the pros and cons of the build. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To begin with, before we dive into the details of the composition, let's talk about the pros and cons of playing Hellion Invoker. There's a few reasons to run a Hellion Invoker, but at the top of the list, the two strengths of the comp are early game and late game. Early game Ziggs is a fantastic carry, especially with Static Shiv. Hitting 5 Hellion during stage 2 is a huge power spike that helps propel you into the mid game with a lot of health and good economy. Then once you hit the late game, Teemo comes into play. While Teemo does target randomly, if you can 2-star him, he does an absurd amount of damage. On top of that, you have a fair amount of utility between Kennen, Lulu, Ivern, and whichever frontliner you're running, such as Volibear or Rel. As for the cons of the build, they're actually similar to the strengths. While yes, early game Hellions are strong, you do have to 2-star the majority of them to maintain a win streak. And without decent items on Ziggs or Kennen, you're going to lose rounds more often than you'll win them. This means you really can't hard force early Hellions, as you need to hit them naturally. Next is finding Teemo is difficult. There are plenty of pivots you can do from early game Hellions, but specifically for the Teemo transition, if you're unable to find and upgrade him, you're going to be in a bad spot come endgame. Plus, Teemo costs health, so you need to be in a reasonable position once you hit level 8 to even play him consistently. And lastly, Teemo has a lot of RNG because of his targeting. Some fights he just won't attack the champion you need him to, like the enemy Draven freely attacking. Teemo won't be your only damage dealer late game, but it's not improbable to lose fights because he never ended up throwing his ability at the enemy carry. Let's now move on and talk about the core items for Hellion Invoker. We should have mentioned that this composition is quite flexible in the items that you use. But before we get into exact items, it's worth breaking down which champions you want to itemize. Early game, the two choices are Ziggs and Kennen. The Ziggs can hold a multitude of items that can be transferred over to other champions later. Kennen, on the other hand, is likely going to stick with the items you give him unless you wish to drop Hellion's late game. There's no real best in slot items for Ziggs, but preparing for an eventual switch over to Teemo is a good way to think about how you want to build him. Hands down, the best items for Hellions, particularly in the early game, is Static Shiv. Both variations are good, though Shadow Shiv is better for more consistent damage. Despite being nerfed in 11.11, the lightning procs are the main reason that this item does well with Hellions, as they naturally have high attack speed. From there, you can add another Static Shiv, Rageblade, or Guardian Angel. All of those transfer easily to Teemo as your late game carry. Shojin, Blue Buff, and Jeweled Gauntlet are also acceptable items which open the door for pivoting into different comps if needed. As for Kennen, the two best items for him are Guardian Angel and Morellonomicon. Preferably shadow variations of both items, though it's not a necessity if you're unable to find the components. Other defensive items do well on Kennen, including Warmogs, Bramble Vest, and Shadow Dragonclaw. Other items worth considering are the newly reworked Shadow Trapclaw, which helps protect your backline. Redemption is also a worthwhile investment which you can give to Lulu or another backliner to help protect your squishy champions from AoE. It can also be given to the frontline, but Kennen is going to be moving around in the fight, so you may not get as much value out of it. The last item to consider is the Hellion Spatula item made from Spatula and Shadow Bow. This will let you flex into additional units while keeping 5 Hellions in the late game. It also opens up the possibility of running 7 Hellion, though you lose a lot of utility by doing that. The best champions to consider giving the Hellion Spat item to are Ryze, Heimerdinger, or Kindred. Alright, with items covered, let's switch over to the core champions and traits. First off, let's go ahead and preface this by saying you can pivot out of early Hellions into quite a few builds. Because of that, we'll be focusing on the main composition of playing for Teemo late game. Later on, we'll briefly cover potential pivots, but for now, let's focus on early Hellions transitioning into Teemo. The core board of early Hellions is easy. Play all 5 Hellions. Ziggs will be the main item carry, though you can itemize Kennen to carry you. It mainly depends on which components you find. As we said during the cons section, it can be difficult to play Hellions if you're not finding them naturally, so we recommend not playing them early if you're unable to find Ziggs 2, Lulu, and Kennen. Ideally, you want to hit Kennen 2 during stage 3, if not earlier. Onward from level 5, you can really add in anything, though adding more frontline or utility is helpful. Zyra, for example, pairs well with Ziggs and provides CC. Lux is a fantastic Mystic to add in with Lulu and lets you bait the opposite corner of where your Ziggs is. Otherwise, more frontline is always good, especially if you can find an early rel. Once you hit the mid-game, the composition begins to come together, though you're unlikely to find all the necessary pieces until level 8. Ideally, your level 8 board should look something like Teemo, Lulu, Kennen, Poppy, Kled, Ivern, Volibear, and Kindred. Now keep in mind you can substitute a lot of these champions out, and you certainly don't have to run 5 Hellions. Dropping Kled and Poppy lets you add in Heimerdinger, Rel, or another Mystic. It's also possible to add in Syndra and Karma to play 4 Invoker. The key thing to keep in mind late game is you want Teemo as your main carry, with Kennen as your backup damage and utility. Mystic is an easy addition to the comp because of Lulu, and so is Invoker to pair with Teemo. But to simplify what to look for in the endgame, the core composition should be Teemo, Lulu, Kennen, Ivern, Volibear, and Kindred. Either keep 5 Hellions or add in more utility traits to round out your board. Moving on, let's do a brief overview of each stage of the game, starting with the early game. Most components from the beginning carousel will be useful at some point during the game, but specifically for a Hellion opening, it's good to try to procure a tier. This is because tier builds into Shiv, which we've established is a core item for Ziggs, but can also turn into Blue Buff, Shojin, or even Frozen Heart. Basically, you have a lot of options if you don't hit the early Shiv. Otherwise, Rod is also a good choice as it can be used for Morellonomicon, Rageblade, or Jeweled Gauntlet. As we've already mentioned a few times, the goal for your early game is to find Hellions. We highly recommend not forcing it, as playing a bunch of 1-star Hellions will usually lose you rounds, so pivot out of them as an opening if you're not 2-starring at least Ziggs by 2-5. By far the best opening is finding Lulu from the early PvE rounds. This sets you up for 5 Hellions as soon as you hit level 5, generally around 2-5. If not, try to stay level 4 as long as you can, though as mentioned, if you're not hitting upgrades by 2-5, you likely want to consider pivoting. The absolute latest to hold on to 1-star Hellions is Krugs, unless the rest of the lobby is low rolling and you're on a win streak. Overall, the early game is to plan to find Ziggs 2, items for him or Kennen, and play 5 Hellions. Onward to the mid game. Stage 3 should be a breeze if you hit your early Hellions, just add in whichever relevant champion you want at level 6. It's possible to win streak all through stage 2 and 3 with Hellions, but honestly, just keeping your health high is what matters the most. Build up your economy and get ready for stage 4. Ideally, you want to hit level 7 no later than 4-1 and earlier if possible. Definitely push levels prior to 4-1 if you're on a win streak and try to preserve it. Remember, the goal is to maintain high health as you want to hit level 8 with a good economy and ideally above 60 health. While rolling on level 7 is normal, you may be able to skip it if you naturally hit upgrades like Kennen 2 and Lulu 2. But if you absolutely need to roll, try not to dip below 40 gold. The plan for stage 4 is the fast 8, as this is the best way to find an early Teemo. Fast 8 depends entirely how well stage 2 and 3 went. Preferably you want to hit level 8 by 4-5 if not earlier. The easy rule to follow here is to level to 8 only if you have at least 30 gold left over, as that gives you enough gold to roll if needed. In the case of leveling on 4-5, you can wait to roll until Raptors or the round after unless you're losing rounds and bleeding a lot of health and need to stabilize. Before we move on, let's take a step back and talk about mid-game pivots. Early Hellion openings have the luxury of being quite flexible in the mid-game, and you don't have to keep playing them later. What you pivot into depends a bit on your items, but in general, you're going to want to play an AP comp as they all transition the easiest from early game Hellions. This means you can pivot towards Brand Abomination or Brand Hecarim, Karma, or Vel'Koz. Or if you hit an early enough Heimerdinger, you can also run him. Karma works best if you have an early blue buff. Look to roll a bit more at 7 if you're trying to pivot towards her as the carry and add in a few Dawnbringers and another Invoker like Syndra or Ivern. That said, blue buff works well with Brand, but requires you to hit earlier than 7 as Brand compositions primarily reroll on level 6. So if you're finding a lot of early Brands in either Hecarim 2 or Nunu 2, you can pivot at level 6 towards one of those comps. Another potential pivot with blue buff is either going for Katarina or LeBlanc in Assassins. This pivot works even better if you have Morellonomicon and Guardian Angel to give Morgana, as the composition for both carries usually runs 4 Assassin and 3 Coven. Overall, as we said, the best pivots for early Hellion will be AP compositions. However, Ziggs can hold on to most items well, including physical damage items, so you always can transition into other builds depending on what components you have after Wolves. Now, for the late game. Once you're level 8, you want to roll a bit to find a Teemo, as he's the most important unit. Heimerdinger can be an alright secondary choice if you can't find Teemo, but the core build of the late game of Hellion Invoker needs Teemo, thus finding him is a top priority. With enough health, you should be able to slowly roll your gold after level 8 and won't have to all in. After you find Teemo, you can add in the rest of the composition as you find units and work towards level 9 if you've stabilized. If you haven't stabilized yet, keep rolling and stay level 8. Only go for level 9 once you've started to win rounds. All in all, the late game is not all that difficult to play, it's just a matter of luck as to when you find your Teemo. As for positioning your late game board, mostly keep Teemo tucked far away into the corner as much as possible. This, along with Guardian Angel if you have it, should put you in the best position for Teemo to make use of the Cruel trait. Cruel will win you any round that ends up with Teemo against one other champion. Keep in mind that Hellion clones currently don't have traits, so a clone Teemo won't proc Cruel. Keep Lulu near your backline to boost their attack speed, and don't get caught off guard by items like Shroud or units like Thresh or Vel'Koz. Against assassins, you can clump up all your units together in the corner, which should result in an easy win. Besides that, there's not much you need to do in terms of positioning. And that's all for today's video, folks. All in all, the best part about playing Hellions is they provide a lot of flexibility in the mid-game, thanks to a strong early game. This means you won't have to commit to playing them, making this one of the more flexible compositions in the current meta. Let us know in the comment section below which composition you'd like us to cover in the next How to Play video. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.